Thank you very much. Another 18 minutes left. It's a quick one. Did anyone see talk in the room? Well, I always hate going to see someone's talk right before mine because I get a little bit self-conscious, especially if it's somewhat related, and I feel like this is a 20-minute highlight of what he just spoke about. A little bit different here for the two that were here. So, my name is MikeWylie. I run my own company for the last 13 years, and I just recently sold it to Richie Solutions. So I'm looking to transition here now. I'm the director of cybersecurity services. Before that, I did penetration testing, blue teaming, building cybersecurity programs for organizations, mostly out of California. In cybersecurity, I think I did about 20 different certifications in the last 2 years. I work for a plethora of things, cloud security, GRC, marketing tech, and we're really building up in the financial sector. So this is a 4-long talk. I compress it now down into 17 minutes left. A little bit more of instances and different frameworks that I can don't like. But the one thing I want to take away from NIST is a quote: "Preventing problems is often less costly and more effective than reacting to them after they occur." Before going over the goals, we took a story that he gave me was pretty interesting. And so what he did was he did a penetration test. He had his report that he went over with the client, and one of the recommendations he gave out was you need to have HTTPS website. And of course, this was an e-commerce website, so you would have thought they already had that, but they didn't. And the business owner or the management team didn't understand why. They said, it's going to cost me money. Why should I do that? Well, here's the security reasons. You need encryption, you protect cardholder data, etc. But what is it going to do for me? And so he finally had to go back and think about that and look at the business case and say, well, okay, if you do HTTPS, Google's going to give you a higher ranking. You're going to get better SEO. Immediately he said, let's put these 3 people on it. Let's do this right away. So he had to start changing the way he wrote these reports and aligning some of the things that he did with the business goals rather than just security. And I wanted to take the presentation here and give it a little more high level and help some of you in your organizations present some of these topics, especially around incident response and defense, to management, especially senior management, who might not understand the importance of what we're doing. And I'm passionate about technology and security, and so I love sitting there, spinning up new servers, security tools. I come to one of these conferences and I go home and spend hours and hours playing with this stuff, but unless we have the business case and we can align it with business goals, it's very hard to sell that. And so I have an MBA. I spent 2.5 years doing a lot of business cases and SWOT analysis, and so I might be able to help you with some of that transition or bridge the gap between business and what we do as far as security. So we're going to talk a little bit about aligning business goals, be able to demonstrate relevance to management, highlight some finds in recent cases, look at case studies, give you some ammo, and look at some of the incident response budgeting. Okay, and so the one thing I'm seeing as far as some trends, before, and this isn't that far in the past, a couple of years ago even, we saw on the before side, this all came from Harvard Business Review. So they looked at a couple of the different breaches, and they looked at their stock prices before, during, and after their breaches, and they kind of looked at what happened. So Home Depot had a 21% increase in, it's not events per second, it is, anyone know? Earning per share. You get a book. So yeah, remember to do one of these. Okay, and then by the end of February 2014, Target had the highest percent stock price regain in 5 years that they saw. 2014, Sears, after their breach, stock price rose after the breach announcement as well. It was a steady increase after that. And $90 million of Target's breach-related costs were covered by cyber insurance. So it was a lot of like push it off, or how is it really going to impact us? Everyone was talking about reputation loss, but then we're seeing, well, if there's reputation loss, why is the value of their stock in the company going up after this? And so I saw a lot of this, and it was a little bit troubling to me in the past. And now what I'm seeing is more of, in the recent years, just in the last year or two even, that we're seeing okay, maybe it's not reputation loss, but there's some other quantifiable metrics that we can use as far as harm to the company. So 2018, recently Uber paid or is projected to pay a record $148 million for concealing their data breach, right? So they didn't do what they were supposed to, they had a big data breach, and now they have to pay a bunch of fines. 2018, Facebook, this is again a could, but they're supposed to face $1.63 billion in fines for the GDPR breach that they had, or violating GDPR. 2018, Atlanta paid $2.6 million. Apparently that's even going up, and if you were at Jake Williams' talk, he talked a lot about that. To cover from the ransomware breach, 2016, Yahoo had to pay, and this one was interesting because it wasn't a fine and it wasn't a loss in reputation, but they actually had to write a check for $350 million to Verizon because they didn't do the right thing, they didn't announce it in time, and there was a lost reputation. So I don't know how they came up with that figure, but they had to give them a check for $350 million to say basically, sorry, we did bad. Okay, and so I like to give this scenario when I talk about incident response, and I think this helps when you talk to senior management or executives and not just talking about the nerd stuff that we do so much, but give them a little bit of a scenario on what this is like. And so I use this as an illustration for students when I teach as well as for executives. And I was going to change this because I realize if you're from Georgia, you're probably not as familiar with earthquakes as I am, right? But as I was going to change it, because sometimes when I go to different regions or areas, I adjust the scenario. But in this case, I was thinking about it on my way here, and I don't know what to do for a hurricane. So I can't really help you there. So you're going to have to try and think about this from my scenario. You take your family to California. Maybe it's a business trip, and your family's sightseeing. They're on the Hollywood or Sunset Strip. They're taking a look at the different things, the stars and whatnot. And then middle of the day, there's a major earthquake. And you're at a client's office or a conference room, and they're out on the strip, and you think, what am I going to do? I want to check on my family, make sure they're okay. And if you didn't plan this out, I kind of go through this essentially a tabletop scenario with some of my clients. So in California in the past, in Northridge, we had a big earthquake. Some of the roads did collapse. Water pipes were bursting. The supermarkets were sold out of certain foods and water, and cell phone towers were not working quite well. So if you think about that, how do you communicate if the cell towers are down? And I started thinking about this as well for myself of, okay, if the cell towers do go down, there's hardly no landlines left, so I'm not going to be able to call my family. I have a ham radio, but my wife doesn't know how to use it, and we haven't talked about what tower we're going to use or frequency or anything like that. If I want to start driving, or you want to drive to your family or whoever you're trying to get to, if the roads are collapsed, or if Waze doesn't work, or Google Maps don't work, it's a little bit challenging. I even thought about this most recently because my wife's pregnant, and we were thinking about, well, if there's an emergency, where's the nearest hospital? And so I Googled it, but besides Googling it, I didn't know how to get there or the directions. So some of these things, we take technology for granted, and it helps us in our everyday lives, but we also, it can potentially be an issue in a disaster situation. Do you have the skills to provide first aid? Right? I can obviously Google or YouTube how to put a tourniquet on, but if I've never done that or practiced it or seen anyone do it, it's probably not the best for me just to figure that out on the spot. And then if you're thirsty, do you have water in your car? Do you keep these things nearby? In your house, do you have anything? I know they say, well, you can go to the toilet bowl and you can drink water out of that, but has anyone looked at their toilet bowl recently? The tank of it? Mine has some like reddish orange color to it. I don't know what's in there. Don't want to really drink that. And then if you're hungry, obviously we have food in our refrigerator, but what if it's the day before grocery day? Or what if then, because the pipes burst, McDonald's is closed, or Chick-fil-A, I guess out here is really popular. So you can't really get food in that case. You have some type, you talked about this with your family, and this has even prompted me in my own life to talk with my family of, I want to go see if they're okay, but what if they're coming to see if I'm okay and we can't call each other? So not having a plan set forth and really just saying, well, if that happens, we'll deal with it, it can end up costing us a lot more in the future. And I think having a scenario like this will help you talk to management if they don't really understand the technological part of incident response, but give them something they can relate to. And maybe change earthquake if you're from Georgia to something you could relate to, but for me, it's an earthquake. Okay, and so I can kind of then transition that into a scenario that they might actually see. And so this was a case that I worked on, incident response for a post-production house in the Los Angeles area. One of the colorists ends up calling and report an incident. It was a senior editor. They finished a large blockbuster film. You can imagine it was like $500 million production. And they said the mouse started moving. And then they saw that the project inside the editor tool closed down. A different project ended up opening up. The editor didn't really, they had an incident response plan, but obviously no one really read that. Pulled the plug on the system. And so they ended up calling us out and saying, can you take a look at this? We want to figure out, did the next blockbuster movie just get hacked? Is it going to be on Pirate Bay tomorrow? Was this just a glitch? What really happened here? And so we came out to look at it. And so in this scenario, if you're thinking this through, talking with your executive, do we have advanced logging? And in this case, no, there was no advanced logging. There was no record of pretty much anything that was happening. They had a free version of some type of NetFlow or SFlow, so we could see some transactions, but it was only recording up to an hour. So by the time we got there, there was no data left there too. No full packet capture on the network, no central log system. The users weren't trained to preserve volatile memory, so they thought, oh, something's going on, let me just pull the plug, and then we lost a lot of data there. The VNC, it was installed on every system in the network without any type of logging, and of course they had the same password for the last 15 or 20 years. So we really couldn't figure much out there either. There was no baselines of any systems, networks, or how they should look or how they shouldn't look, so it was very difficult. And so coming back to this, maybe you can play a scenario like this to management or senior management or even your supervisor, walk through the disaster, national disaster that they can relate to, and then something else like this that's maybe somewhat relevant and talk about all these things could happen and then what would we do in these scenarios. And sometimes when I do tabletop exercises, anyone, let me get a hands up if anyone's done tabletop exercises. Get a few people. Has anyone done a ransomware tabletop exercise? A couple? And for those couple people that have done that, have you discussed in that tabletop exercise who makes the decision if you pay the ransom? Anyone? Did you do that? Two of them? That's good. A lot of times when we go through that scenario, people don't even think about that. It's kind of quiet in the room. They say, well, we thought about ransomware. That's in the news everywhere, but we never really thought about who's going to pay that at that point, or who's going to make that decision, and if we only have 24 hours, what's going to happen? Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip through these since we briefly spoke and I'm a little short on time. So I pulled this statistic up here of data breaches. Purposely didn't want to grab numbers or dollar numbers, but I wanted to pull records since these seem to be a little more accurate. So these are a bunch of big data breaches that happened recently and the number of records that were stolen. Obviously, Yahoo has that giant line above everyone else, but we can still see the others are in the millions as well. So my biggest issue, and this kind of goes back to what Jake just spoke about in the other room, is that with some of these breach statistics, how do you quantify the impact of the breach, right? So we'll see, they'll say we've had this many dollars spent, we've spent this much time, we do whatever, but it's kind of different depending on who you ask. And so quantifying reputation as well. Let's say we have lost reputation in the past. I didn't have these fines that I could bring to the CEOs or CIOs or CISOs to say this is what it's going to cost you or has cost people in the past. But they'd say, okay, well, reputation, we get it. If we leak the new Marvel or Disney or Netflix or whatever film we're working on, or if we have 50 million credit cards that are stolen stuff, yes, we have reputation harm, but going back to some of that other data there, our stock price might actually still go up. It's not really going to do that much of reputation, and we can't really measure that. Regulations on reporting breaches are fairly new and unclear, so GDPR, if anyone's had to deal with that, there's a lot of questions and ambiguity with that. And then the new California Consumer Privacy Act, if you're doing any business in California, that one is one of my favorites. There's missing sentences, like the sentences just stop in the laws that they've passed, so you don't really even know where they're going with some of that stuff. And so they also have some of the privacy laws and the breach laws are now having reasonably likely to cause harm. And I'll show you a couple of slides on that coming up here. But there's also some discretion on the company of, did we really think someone did this? Or if they stole the laptop, could they really have seen the data on it? We're going to say no and not report it. We also see that the media figures, there's no vetting to it. I've clicked through some of these different articles on whether it was the Atlanta data breach or the Yahoo, and it's these reporters that hear a number, and if you just look at the Atlanta data breach and what it cost, you'll find numbers anywhere from $1 million to $17 million. And And that's a little bit of a gap between there. And sometimes I'll see articles and I look at the date and then the amount they're reporting, and they're still all over the place. So I don't know where these people are getting the figures. They'll cite someone else or some other article, then that you go there, and that one cites some other. They're kind of like citing each other in this vicious circle. Thresholds and obfuscation, get out of jail free card. So some states, and I'll show you a picture on that coming up as well, that there's certain states that if you don't hit a certain threshold of records that you've had breached, or you've obfuscated them or encrypted them, and those terms are very vague as well. So if you obfuscate the data or truncate it, so if you take the last digit off your social security number, is that still a breach? Do they still have to report that? That's not the true record. And then most of the statistics are based off of interviews of large corporations. So you say, what's the average cost of a ransomware incident? Well, you look at what survey they're citing, and it was Fortune 500s, or it was the Fortune 500s that got breached, or whatever that was. And it's not the smaller companies, so it's not true data that they have out there. And then it's also biased. And Jake just talked a lot about this, but there's a lot of reasons to underreport or overreport on this. Couple different things. So I did a lot of research on the financial sector and breaches, because I found 4 CVEs this year in tax software. So if you use a CPA, there's a good chance that your data is flying across in clear text on the network. So I've reported those to vendors, and they're still working on it from the beginning of this year. So I thought, well, I want to see if there's what people are reporting on as far as breaches in California, because we have this new California Consumer Privacy Act, and a few years ago they revised another breach notification law that talked about you have to submit your breaches to a database. And so I found some interesting things when I searched every single breach record that I could find relating to tax and CPA in the California database. We saw statements like, we found unauthorized access to our secured network. Okay, well, if it was so secured, how did you get breached, and why are you reporting your breach in this database? The attacker managed to hack into our computer systems despite the use of firewall and antivirus. Okay, so it's still not secure, though. Backup hard drive was stolen, though they require proprietary software for files to be readable. Okay, you can use strings against that, or you can download the free trial and still get that stuff. We take aggressive steps to protect your information to ensure all records are securely locked. The data was not securely locked, it was unencrypted, and therefore you had to report it. If it was even encrypted or truncated or obfuscated, you didn't even have to report this. So even though we have these laws and regulations coming out as far as breach notifications, we're still seeing a lot of businesses are trying to protect their reputation themselves, and they're not really accurately reporting the information they have, or they're trying to skew it so it doesn't look like they're so bad. Okay, a couple quick case studies. I'm going to breeze through these since I'm almost out of time. Yahoo, they had 2 different breaches, if you weren't aware. One of them was a smaller one, only 500 million records. And then the larger one was the 3 billion that made a lot of news. And this is one of the first ones that we saw real tangible, quantifiable numbers out of this. And so we saw that, I'm going to skip over to the next slide so we can see those. We saw that they had, the SEC actually fined them. They stepped in and said, we're going to fine you $35 million for failure to promptly report. So you didn't let everyone know about this breach in time. And then Verizon also took a check from them for $350 million because the lack of reputation, or that they didn't let them know about some of this during due diligence. The Atlanta ransomware incident, obviously earlier this year, they had multiple people involved with this. A lot of this could have been fixed. They had SMB version 1 and public-facing servers. This was all reported from security researchers. They had a lot of people involved. And so this is one, I'm still digging for a lot more information on the Atlanta one. The reason I'm interested on government agencies, because they have to report more than the private sector does, and they're a little bit more held to that standard. And so we can actually see that broken down. So rather than Yahoo saying, we had to spend all this money and we have no idea what that is, at least with this Atlanta one, we can see breakdown who they paid and how much. We don't know exactly what they did. So you had an MSSP come in for $60,000. Well, what exactly did they do? Did they augment the staff? How long were they there? We don't see those invoices, but at least we can see that they're $60,000. And I'm sure if we file for requests, we might be able to have access to a little bit more of this. But we could see that they had PR companies come in, Cisco for malware, reverse engineering. They had SecureWorks come in, E&Y come in for incident response. And then this one as well. This is probably one of the first ones. There's debate between a couple different companies, but Voya Financial, they're a top 25 broker in the US. So if you think of like one of your online trading companies, they have $480 million in assets. But they were fined $1 million from the SEC. This is one of the first times that we've seen a fine from the SEC just for the breach, not for failure to report on time, but just for an actual breach. Okay, and then this is another part that's really interesting is privacy laws. We're seeing a lot of them come in that are actually having quantifiable laws. So in California, 2020, if you're doing any business with us in California or have any residents in California, there's a couple different thresholds, but we're seeing that there's actual quantifiable fines for every record that you have breached or every violation. GDPR, tons of money that people are getting fined for that as well. And in the past, it was really just the Attorney General could sue you, your company, or file a lawsuit if you didn't follow the law, but now we're actually seeing a physical dollar amount in these laws. And we can see that a lot of different states, almost every single state here has an electronic breach laws. Some of them are also paper. Some of them do have a harm threshold. So if you have a certain number of records or if there's no harm or reasonable assumption of harm, then you don't have to report. And then we see a lot of other laws that are industry specific. So if you're in healthcare and other areas. Okay, and so my last slide here, lessons learned. So what we saw is that there's high tangible costs associated with some of these incidents, whether it's you have to pay a ransom, you have the IR consultants need to come in, breach notices, regulatory fines, and these are all increasing. We see that incidents could have been prevented at a lower cost if you would have done a little bit better defense. And then breaches need to be reported promptly. And if they're not, we're starting to see a lot more of the customers and laws come into place that are now forcing businesses to do this. And so sometimes it's even in a contract that says, we will not do business with you unless you have incident response and all these defenses in place. So that is for the slides. It was a quick 20-minute truncated version of my longer talk. If anyone has any questions, I have 2 things to hand out. I already give one out. So questions and prize for the question. It's good. Yes? Yes. Yeah. Well, it's funny you mention that because I was thinking about that right before the talk of like, wow, it's up to $17 million. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So the question was my thoughts on should they have paid the ransom in the beginning, or is it good that they went ahead and did their own incident response? Well, they were originally asking the attackers or adversaries were asking for I think $50,000. So I think financially it would have been better for them in that case to pay it. My personal take on it is do not negotiate with terrorists, and we see an increase, 165% I think increase somewhere around there in ransomware in 2014, quarter over quarter, because people were paying it. So I think it encourages it, but you're going to have to make that own decision within your organization. I can't tell you what's right or wrong. And if you want to come up, I'll give you this one for the question. Any other question? Yeah. When I think because they started, if I remember correctly from the timelines that I saw, was that it was taken away, but they had already or publicly talked about the incident, or that they were not going to pay. I don't know which one it was, but the city of Atlanta talked about it before that, and then it was taken down after that. Any other questions? Yes, in back. So the question is about cyber security insurance and how that's going. So I know I think it was the Yahoo incident that they ended up paying, the insurance paid $90 million out of the couple $100 million or whatever it was. I think Jake, his last talk was really good on this as far as, yeah, if you hadn't seen that, he talked about how a lot of them aren't paying out exactly. I've seen some clauses that say you have to be doing X, Y, Z beforehand. You have to have due care, and if you're negligent, there's certain things that don't fall in that. But I think that in the past, they were pushing it off on that. They were taking the risks, and they were transferring it to someone else. But now I don't think that's really fixing the problem. Sometimes they're saying we're not going to pay the fines, or we'll do it, but you have a whatever $1 million deductible. And some things are getting padded in there, like Jake was just talking about, that shouldn't really be in there. So I would recommend cyber insurance. I just don't think it's the ultimate solution. You can't have no security and then just transfer the risk to someone else. Thank you. I think he left, so if you want to come grab the book for your question. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.